So the big day today in Moscow. Yes, Vladimir Putin giving his State of the Union speech. Now, this is awkward for me. The cause of this war is awkward for me, and I can't hide away from what I said in the past. Here's a quick clip of me in 2014. Today we are rushing through an association agreement at undue speed with the Ukraine, and as we speak, there are NATO soldiers engaged in military exercises in the Ukraine. Have we taken leave of our senses? Do we actually want to have a war with Putin? Because if we do, we're certainly going about it the right way. Now look, I said that. I believe we made some terrible mistakes in the past. None of that means I support what happened on the 24th of February last year. But it's a message that Putin kept pushing today. This is him basically saying today in Moscow, it's not us, we didn't do it, the other side did.
Started the war. We did everything to stop it, but Sevastopol was next. I want to say it again. It was them who have unleashed the war, and we used and are using the force to stop it.
Now he then said that the West is in terminal, decadent decline. Here's what he had to say about the Anglican Church and its consideration of a gender-neutral God.
As it became known, the Anglican Church, for example, plans at this point, to consider the idea of a gender-neutral God. What can I say? May God forgive them, for they know not what they do.
Well, that was him mocking the West. Maybe with some reason, I don't know. And finally, perhaps the slightly worrying part where he talks about suspension of the Russian commitment to the START treaty.
Russia does not abandon the treaty, but suspends its participation. Before resuming the discussion of this treaty, we must first understand what do such countries of NATO, like France and Great Britain, aspire to do, and how will we take their strategic arsenals into account?
Well, that was Putin today. I'm joined by Lieutenant General David Leakey, former Black Rod. David, interesting with that speech. Nothing especially new, although, you know, talking about suspending, perhaps withdrawing from a nuclear proliferation treaty, is that escalation?
The absolutely key thing about this escalation debate that's going on, the very important point, is that nobody should jerk the escalation. It must be a smooth one. And if it's a smooth one, it gives a chance for a graduated escalation, little step by little step. If anyone jerks it, then there could be a petulant response, particularly by Putin.
Okay.
And so I think all this rhetoric, Putin's speech yesterday, last night, Biden's speech today, a little bit talk about withdrawing from the START today. These are all gradual, diplomatic, saber-rattling steps. I don't see any great risk or danger in that. That's just part of the orchestra, part of the choreography of what's going on here.
So when two former prime ministers stand up in the House of Commons last night and suggest sending the entirety of the RAF to Ukraine to be at President Zelensky's disposal, is that not escalation? Well,
you've got to be very careful what you do, not what you say. And I think, and I was actually most interested about what, in one of the clips you were saying, showed there was some very well-dressed, smartly dressed Russian officers, male and female. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the key things in all of this is Putin knows the reality. He is preaching propaganda, a confection of propaganda that we've just heard, to his people. And nobody dares say anything or promote anything against that propaganda, and particularly if you're in uniform. And we've seen what's happened. I'm very glad I'm not a senior officer in the Russian army at the moment, because if I said what I would want to say, what I would say if I was a senior serving British officer in the Ministry of Defence or in the chain of command anywhere, I would be, our generals do tell it as it is, the reality. But if you do that in Russia, then you end up jumping out of a 16-floor window. Yeah. And this is the difference between part of the difference between the values of what goes on in Russia and what goes on here. What Putin has been saying about escalation, he's going to use nuclear weapons, he's going to do this, he's going to do that, is much more belligerent than a couple of former prime ministers making a threat about sending a few jets. I mean, it's of a different order.
I fully understand that. I wasn't trying to draw equivalents, but both sides are ratcheting up the debate. What was interesting, and you're quite right, no one dares criticise, there wasn't really much warm applause going on from those clips that we saw earlier. The one thing Putin did not do at all, was to acknowledge that a year ago, when the tanks rolled towards Kyiv, and when he must have thought that a very quick victory was on the cards, there was no acknowledgement that I could see today that it hasn't gone very well, is it?
No, he's not going to. It's not in the propaganda playbook to advertise the failures and lack of successes. And so he's never, ever going to do that. He's not going to allow... In fact, it's quite the reverse. He's painting such an unrealistic picture of what's going on in the Donbass region, in particular in Ukraine, that when the Russians do finally discover the truth, as they will, then there is going to be a convulsive upset inside Russia. And I think one of the things that's interesting, and people are talking about it, is how will this play out? When will it end? I mean, it's the $64,000 question everybody wants answered.
Well, could there be a peace negotiation? Is that possible? Otherwise, it seems to me this could go on for years.
No, well, of course there could be a peace. So there won't be, in my view, I don't think there will be a decisive outcome on the battlefield, because neither side has the decisive strength to impose their will over the others on the battlefield. The Russians don't, and the Ukrainians don't, yet. I don't think that will happen, and I don't think we'll see that happen even during the course of this year, and possibly not even during the course of next year. So to go back to your point, the only way that this is going to end, there are only two ways this is going to end, is through a diplomatic negotiation which might lead to a ceasefire, might lead to a peace. That is the only possibility of a cessation or an end to this year or next year. There is one other solution, and that is if the Russians discover the truth, and then there could be a convulsion.
You mean on casualty figures?
On casualty figures, and I think casualty figures would be a huge thing if the Russians knew exactly what was going on. And it does sort of surprise me that we in the West, for all our control of cyber, mastery of cyber and so on, haven't been able to get the real message over to the Russians. Of course, there is a real message circulating amongst Russians, but so great is the repression and fear in Russian society that nobody dares say it, even if a lot of people even do know it. But I think there may come a point if the setbacks become so great that the Russian elite decide that enough is enough.
Well, in 1917, of course, it was losses in the First World War and surrender to Germany that led, of course, to the revolution.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things we should fear, actually, is that a sudden jerking end to this could be bad in a number of ways. As I said, if there's a jerky escalation, then somebody could get petulant. Putin could be petulant and irrational. And the other thing that could happen is if there's a convulsive end within Russia, as we've seen throughout the last 100 years or more of Russian history. If there is an internal convulsion, it goes badly for quite a few years. And I think an internal convulsion in Russia at the moment would be worse than a smooth transition to an alternative regime.
David Leakey, a lot to think about there. Thank you very much indeed for coming in and joining us this evening. Well, it's quite a sombre, thoughtful moment, isn't it? I'm afraid this is the biggest land war that's happened in Europe since 1945, and there's no end to it in sight.